Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome once again to the RSM In Conversation webinars. Now then, one or two of you have noticed via Twitter that this year we seem not to have acknowledged Holocaust Memorial Day. Last year, you'll remember we had Anita Lasker-Waldfish and her daughter Maya talking to me, and gripping it was, and it's still available on YouTube. If you haven't seen it, please do. But this year we're going to do something different. Again, we have two guests, but we're trying a rather different format. Now, our guests, Noemie Lopian and Derek Niemann, will be introducing themselves. Now, I know some of you mention quite often that I talk too much, and who's to say you aren't wrong. But today you're going to have your wish, because I'm not going to do any of the talking at all for at least 40 minutes. I'm not even going to introduce our guests, because they're going to do themselves, and they're going to do two presentations from two very divergent perspectives. But hopefully, in the end, you will see how it all comes together, and there's a complementarity that makes the end greater than the sum of its parts. You won't hear from me until both are finished, but I promise you, at least they promise me, that there will be plenty of time for discussion. I'll be monitoring your questions as you submit them, and once again doing my usual trick, separating out the wheat from the chaff, and of course, only asking the chaff. Only joking, only joking. So, Derek, you are going to kick this off, if I've got this right. So I hand over the screen, the platform, the floor, and everything else to you. Over to you.
Thank you, Simon, and good evening, everyone. I'm going to start tonight by taking us back to an event that took place immediately before the pandemic started. And I was due to speak at a school, and the speaker before me was a Holocaust survivor. And she gave the talk, and I imagine that a number of the pupils had never seen a Holocaust survivor before, and they were visibly distressed by what she said. She asked if anyone had any questions, and the first question that came up was from a particularly anguished girl. Anguished because this was a girl, a Jewish girls' school. And the girl said, "What can we do to stop this happening again?" And the survivor gave an answer that has stayed with me ever since, because I thought it was so unusual and so profound. She said, "Seek out people who are not like you, people from different religions, different cultures, different backgrounds. Get to know them, befriend them, and understand the world from their point of view." And 2 years before I gave that talk, I was speaking about my grandfather, an SS officer, in a synagogue. And at the end, a woman at the back came to the front and said, "I want us to talk together." That woman showed imagination, courage, and as I was to discover, determination. And that woman was my co-speaker, Noemie. So I'll hand over now to Noemie to give her story, or rather her part of our story.
Thank you for this most eloquent of introductions, and a very warm hello to all of you who joined us. I'm extremely grateful, and I feel it's a privilege that I can share my parents' stories and my thoughts, and why I feel that the Holocaust is still relevant today after so many years, when many of you on here maybe don't have anything to do with that past, or indeed have ever met a Jewish person before. I say to everyone that, of course, times are more modern, as we know. We now have Zoom, which we didn't have then, and I don't have to tell you all the other bits that we have. But what I feel hasn't changed and has stayed the same is human nature. And that is the same. However, we as people are empowered to be able to change ourselves. And hence, I believe in our talks of empowering our audience or challenging our audience, maybe to change and shift their thoughts or their understanding. I came to the Holocaust pretty late in life. I was 36 when I read my dad's story, The Long Night by E.I. Bornstein. I grew up, you might hear by now, I have a little twang in Munich, Germany, Bavaria, a place that had high exposure in World War II, to say the least. Hitler's seat. I was totally unaware. I had a magical childhood, rather egocentric. I felt the world revolved about myself and my siblings. My dad was an elderly dad, and frequently we would ask him, tell us what it was like when you were young, finding it very difficult to imagine him as a young man. And he'd oblige with funny stories of people putting, tickly sprinkles in to make him sneeze and that sort of stuff, and just telling us fun stories, and we could really relate to him. And the rest, he said, is written for you in the long night. And I grew up with this long night on my mother's bookshelf in her very ornate lounge, but that long night had a place on its own. And like my friend only most recently pointed out to me, Noemie, we all grew up with a long night, but somehow I managed to ignore it till I chose to read it after the birth of my youngest daughter at the age of 36. I then wanted to go back to the state of not knowing. But of course, no one is really quite able to do that, not even me with my determination, as Derek puts it. And so when I closed the book, I felt if I were to keep it closed, I would keep all those voices that I mentioned closed, all those souls. And indeed, if any of you get to read The Long Night, you will see for yourselves, and that's not me saying it as my father's daughter, but others who observed and critiqued it, that it's a very objective book, and you will see good and bad in this of most horrific tragedies. And it was the largest tragedy of mankind, because it was not only the tragedy that befell the people who were made to be victims, but those who did it to the victims too, that they could alter. And I say, even though it was translated almost into the time of religion and morality of the land in that time, by Hitler decreeing an Aryan pure race, and therefore tuned into morality and religion at the time, making people, purity goes into goodness, what's pure is good. And of course, now we know it's utter rubbish. If you look at genes, there's no such thing as a pure gene. And so it was very clever. And of course, when you hear Derek's story, you will hear other reasons why people fed into this. And yet, my parents managed to make me grow up with a love of Munich. And I always tell the children, and I'll equally tell you, because this childish streak has remained with me forever, particularly Christmas time. Munich was just magical. It was transformed into winter wonderland. We had those Christmas markets well before they came to the UK. And even locally, the shops were covered, the windows in sort of white, sugary looking like paint, the biscuits, the food. Not only that, my dad qualified post-war, having been to 7 labor and concentration camps over 4.5 years as a doctor and a dentist. He was initially at the age of 17 and 39. He went frequently into hiding. He was born in Zawiercie, Upper Silesia in Poland. On the night that he was caught by the Gestapo, he refused to go into hiding, and he was taken away to his first labor camp on the Tuesday, the 25th of March, 1941. He was, as fortune would have it, if you can call it fortune, reunited with his father. And he managed, by being adept, call it good luck, read it yourself and find out what you think, to return his father to his hometown, because his father had become more poorly. And his father, together with his mother, survived till 1943, when subsequently, my father being the eldest of 4, his parents and his younger sister Noemie, whose name I carry, brother Judah, were taken to Auschwitz and gassed there. My father was taken subsequently to 6 more camps and was liberated by the Americans on the 30th of April, 1945 at the Tutzinger Lake. If you visit it, it's beautiful, close to Munich. He was hospitalized for 8 months and was taken to a displaced persons camp. He was a very focused young man because he tried to return to education and initially studied philosophy, then medicine and dentistry. Whilst being a dentist, he did perhaps something that wasn't very kosher, and he befriended the patient on the chair. I think nowadays we'd get struck off for it, but maybe not. This lady was widowed, elderly, and had no family, no children, and no in-laws. And when I asked my mum, who is alive today, what is her story? Mémé Wolf, we called her the same name that we called my mother's mother. It's the French for grandma. And they were vague, my mum. But what my father taught me was not to be prejudiced. And it only trickled through a lot later. He took this German lady who proudly wore her Tracht. Tracht is the Bavarian uniform that existed this day. Actually, the Queen wore this color green at her husband's memorial yesterday. And my parents made her a close friend, not only to them, but to us. And she taught us the love of Germany, of Christmas, and I suppose to take people for who they are, to go by our famous saying, don't judge the book by its cover. I'd like you to hear a little bit of my father tonight, and there's no one more eloquent than he himself, so bear with me as I read to you and quote. It's describing in his introduction one of his numerous death marches he was on. I have to tell you also just beforehand, he wrote this book very soon after the war. So it's very vivid and very alive. It reads like a reportage. I always say I feel I'm sitting on his shoulder. After so many years, can one now relate to events, thoughts and feelings as one thought and felt them? Probably not. How does a person feel when he sees his companion being shot the moment he stops walking and realizes he can barely walk himself? Of course, at first he carries on. He wants to live. He reaches for his companion's hand to support himself. But he too is at the end of his strength. He pushes the hand away. He can't support the laggard. The weak one is left behind. But that one must have seen from oneself the lifeless face, the flickering eyes of a person about to confront his fate. The bullet strikes his neighbor, and soon he will also be struck. Who can say what such a person experiences whilst walking the final steps of his life? Who can describe what he feels and suffers in these moments? And what did I myself experience on this day? As chosen inmate, I had to carry the bread sack for the capo. That's one of the guards. And as the last one in line, I had to march next to him and the SS man. The SS man shot all those who stopped, and the capo had to record their concentration camp numbers. I looked into the barrel of the gun before the bullet struck the neck. The tottering person looked at the thin stream of blood that ran slowly as life departed the body. I observed the SS man and saw how he ate his open sandwich with appetite, whilst continuing to walk despite his bloody deed. In the nearby fields, there were farmers sowing, and at one of the houses by the roadside, a woman was watering flowers. In this moment, a bullet pierced the head of a straggler. A small stream of blood ran down the temple. And all that happened in the midst of built-up fields and lovingly tended flower gardens. Are we still living in this world? Or was all this a nasty, unending nightmare? How was it possible that people within 50 meters were quietly going to work, whilst in their midst, exhausted, defenseless people were being shot? My father wrote this book and started in the late 40s, early 50s. It took him 10 years to find a publisher. People did not want to know. It is often said that survivors did not talk about this. I think they would have, if they would have found people who had listened. My father wrote it because people didn't understand what had happened. He wrote it for the medical profession, but he wrote it above all for an audience like you, to hear what really happened, the truth, the witness report, so that it should never happen again. Today, the Jewish community is, I think, 0.1% in England. And still, there is hatred of others and different. Rabbi Lord Sachs says, almost similar to how Derek quoted the survivor saying, people not like us are people just like us. But I do believe that we're all born prejudiced. We don't like different. The people that feed into us are those that own the Google, Meta, LinkedIn, and other such platforms. They always give us our echo chamber back. Hence, we need educating to learn to accept different. Ideally, not hate different, but mostly not hurt different, or what is perceived as different. The word anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, is often turned into an academic argument. But when you look at some of them, like from the far right, as I said, Hitler, he treated the Jews as vermin. The far left as the people who take over the world, and the jihadi extremists, the Westerners. I'm conscious of time, and I hope we'll cover more in the questions and answers. And over to my dear eloquent partner, Derek. Thank you.
Thank you, Noemie. Everyone, you've now heard a story of oppression and now a story of the oppressor. I'm going to share my screen and show you some pictures that I didn't see until I was 50 years old. Okay, everyone, so we'll start not in Nazi Germany, but in Glasgow, Scotland. I reached the age of 50 and I didn't know anything about my family. My dad grew up in Germany. His sister married a Scottish soldier and he joined her in the late 1950s. What did your dad do in the war? I said. He was just a pen pusher, an office man, a lowly clerk. I was 50, as I say, when I found out who my grandfather really was. And I'm going to skate through photographs that came from my aunt's garage and from the cellar belonging to a Jewish lady. It all started in very, very normal circumstances. A young couple married after the First World War. Yes, my grandfather had fought in the worst battles of the First World War. He'd been wounded at Passchendaele. He was taken prisoner, kept in captivity until 1920, until the Versailles Treaty was finished, and then lived a normal life. He did what many fathers would do. He took photographs of his growing family. Here's my aunt and her little brother. It's Dortmund, 1928, and there is no evidence at this time that my grandfather had any political affiliations or any interest in politics. Indeed, when the army, the German army, came to Dortmund, he took plenty of photographs, as an old soldier would. There are no swastikas in this picture, but there are in this one. We've certainly gone past 1930. My grandfather signs up for the Nazi Party. Dortmund was a communist city. The Nazis had less than 20% of the vote, and he took photographs that lured him in. This is a brown shirt parade through the city, a provocative act. People were killed in these demonstrations. By the time my grandmother was pregnant with my father, Hitler had come to power. My grandfather doubling up as Oliver Hardy. There was a very serious purpose to this. He would knock on people's doors as an official, a voluntary official, and ask them for their political views. And if they didn't accord with those of Adolf Hitler, he was supposed to report them to the Gestapo. By the time my dad was born, my grandfather was in some difficulty. It's not reflected in this photograph. You have a picture of three happy little children, my dad in the middle with a very nice bobble hat. But there's a dark undertow to this picture. Both children on either side of him are wearing insignia from the Hitler Youth. And the man taking the photograph, my grandfather, is now in some financial difficulty. He's lost his job. He has rent to pay and a wife and three children to support. He says, I can't pay my rent. His friend says, I know somebody could help you. Somebody who went to the same school as you in Hameln. This man was Heinrich Himmler's deputy in the SS. And so my grandfather went to Bavaria to be, I use the word indoctrinated, but he wasn't some 18-year-old being taught how to become a member of ISIS. He was in his 40s. This is a knowledgeable, experienced man who knew just what he was doing. He was in a small cadre of SS men. He knew them all by name. He was supposed to drink with them. This was a camaraderie organization. I worked out that he was drinking with at least 10 men who went on to become concentration camp commandants. He took this photograph of three unknown individuals. And he took this one at the exact location of the Dachau concentration camp visitor center. You could see here the man on the left giving a Hitler salute, probably to the commandant himself. My granddad taking this photograph, he must have been excited. This was a great occasion for him. We move forward. We're now in the late 1930s, and the family have moved to an idyllic estate on the edge of Berlin, just next to the Grunewald. It's a model estate. He now has 4 children, including my uncle in the middle, the only one alive today. And the parents. This photograph was taken just 6 weeks after Kristallnacht. They're living on an SS estate built on Himmler's orders, and every one of the men is either a secret police officer or an SS officer. They're all drunk, having a party. 6 weeks after Kristallnacht, in the very same city, synagogues are burned, people are killed. And in the 550 family photographs, there is a dissonance between what is happening in this family and what's happening outside. This photograph was taken probably around about the time that Noemie's father was taken into captivity. It shows a loving family expressing their love of each other. My aunt on the right with a wardrobe malfunction. My dad hitching up his lederhosen at the front. So hard, it's amazing he managed to have 2 sons. And yet, just miles from here, the war is well underway. German people are being bombed in the center of the city, and there are concentration camps working just 5 miles from here. When I found out by chance who my grandfather was from a random online search, I asked my dad, who's still alive, what was your father like? He said he was a distant man. His chauffeur would turn up and take him to work. He'd go on business trips. He'd be gone for days. He'd come back, only to be preparing to go away again. And when he wasn't absent, he was absent in his head, working in the garden, uncommunicative. My uncle, my older uncle, was taken out of school at the age of 16 and made to fight. He manned the guns. Sounds like a tough job, but this happened at the exact same time that Noemie's entire family, but for her father, were wiped out in Auschwitz. So maybe things weren't quite so hard. Christmas 1944, my uncle has joined the Panzers. Chances of survival a little less than 5%, but what else could he do? At the end of March, my grandfather came home from work and announced that the office was being relocated to the Alps. Imagine. My grandfather's family, the whole family and several other families, driving the length of Germany. And they stopped on the way, as my dad told me. My dad speaking to me on the phone. My wife and I were making the same journey 70 years later. And we stopped, as the family stopped, at Dachau. My dad was going into dementia, and he told me a story that he'd never told me before, and probably had never shared with anyone before. He told me that they arrived at Dachau and were housed in a barracks hut, overlooking a long, low building with a tall chimney. My dad was sitting in his bunk bed, probably lying on it, I imagine. His parents were standing at the window, looking out. His mother said, "You know what they're doing there?" His father said, "No." His mother said, "Well, they're killing them. They're killing the Jews and burning their bodies." His father said, "No, they wouldn't do that." She said, "Of course they would. Can't you smell the flesh?" By then, I knew exactly who my grandfather was. He was a manager of slave labor. His factories were Auschwitz, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen. His workers were people being starved to death. I went into the archive and asked the historians, is it just possible, is it just conceivable that he could go to these places on a very, very regular basis, see skeletal figures, beatings, possibly deaths, and not understand what was happening, not understand the scale of what was happening? They said, it is impossible. I came out to the archive, my wife took this photograph, and I have no recollection of her taking it. That's the difficult bit. The family left Dachau just as we did 70 years later, and we followed them up this valley in the Alps. There was snow on the ground. By the time the snow had melted, the war ended. My family holed up at the top of the valley in a chalet, waiting for who knows what. My dad told me that he remembered a jeep coming up this track. It had 4 American soldiers, heavily armed men inside. They jumped out, they grabbed my dad's sister and said, "Take us to your Nazis." And after that, my grandfather and the other men were beaten up a bit and taken away. What could the rest of the family do but go down to the nearest town? The war had ended the day before. And this photograph, taken by an American soldier, has my dad wearing an American helmet, my uncle Eki wearing a little paper hat. They made it back, not to Berlin, but to my grandfather's in-laws. And there they died before I was even born. Appropriately enough, perhaps, they were buried opposite the Jewish cemetery. And while I was researching this story and writing my book, I drew inspiration from 2 people. One was a man whose own father had committed atrocities in Poland. Bernhard could accept what his father had done, but what he couldn't accept was that his father said, "And I'd do it again." When Bernhard retired as a history teacher, he decided to dedicate the rest of his life, and he's still doing it today, teaching the children of Hameln and the surrounding villages about the Jewish communities that had lived there before Hitler. And he even managed to get them, their parents, to restore the gravestones that were smashed by the Nazis. My other inspiration was the little boy in the paper hat, my uncle Eki. 85 years old, still living in Germany. I gave him a copy of the book in draft form, and his wife helped him translate and read it. He said to me, "I find this very hard, but it is true, and you must tell this story." And as we speak tonight, my uncle and aunt are waiting for the moment when they can invite Noemie and I to speak together in Germany. And so we conclude with two families taking a very different approach. The little family on the left. The 16th century philosopher Montaigne said, "Nothing fixes something so intensely in the memory as the desire to forget it." That was what my family did. That was not what Noemie's family did. And we have talked together for the last 3 years. I dare say you are our 150th audience, and there will be many, many more to come, I hope. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, folks, thank you. Thank you very much. Take a deep breath, everyone. Okay, now I'm at a slight disadvantage because I've read your excellent book here. Very good. I haven't yet got Naomi's, but I will read it, but it didn't arrive in time, I'm afraid. So I know a little bit more about your background than Naomi's, but we'll mix that in. Let's just start a little bit with your background there. And I think first thing is just let's establish two things. I mean, your grandfather, we can call him a Nazi war criminal because he was convicted. That's right. Do you want to say a little bit more about that?
Yes, he was. Yes, he was. In fact, there was a paper in the Nuremberg trial that listed him as one of 4 officers being charged with crimes against humanity and use of slave labor. Now, he wasn't actually tried at Nuremberg. His boss was tried, and they used documents that he had prepared for the SS accounts. And it's quite clear that he knew exactly what was going on. In one place, he listed the number of people that had been killed in a massacre. He listed the date. And he also listed the profits made from 6 railway carriages of clothes. Now, that material was used to hang Oswald Pohl, the controller of concentration camps. Had they had such things as copies in those days, he would have had far more than a 1-year sentence. Well,
who knows by that time, after the maid trials. But I read that bit you just pointed out as unequivocal that his defense would have been that I didn't know, we were just running a business, which he was. I didn't kill anyone myself, and there's no evidence at all that he did, as I understand it. It doesn't look like that's the case. But the account that you've given, you know, he knew there was no question that he could not have known what was the 6 carriages of clothes with no people, what that meant. And then the description also of the interruption to his business by the sudden disappearance of 42,000 of his labor force. And that was what they called Operation Harvest Festival, which was one of the biggest mass murders. So we know he knew, don't we?
Absolutely, yes.
As the historian said, it's not possible that he did not know.
It's not possible. And that was the defense he made at his trial. He said, I didn't know. And then he said, but if I had known, I couldn't have done anything.
Now, what do you think about that? What do you think?
I think it's nonsense. There were people working in the concentration camps who refused to kill Jews, and nothing was done to them. They weren't sacked and they weren't killed. It was just, okay, pass the rifle to the next man.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, again, for those who are not familiar with this literature, it's really important to be clear. As far as we know, not a single German lost their lives or was even prosecuted. I mean, they may have had their careers interrupted and they could have been ostracized and things would, wouldn't have helped them. But there was at no point was a single one ever prosecuted for failing to carry out orders. And there was lots of ways they could refuse and so on. So I think that's also true. I mean, what occurred to me reading the book was that your grandfather was, I mean, there was nothing to say he was a particularly bad man. He fought in the war. He came to National Socialism fairly late. He did rescue some people from, not the extermination camps, that wasn't possible, but from Sachsenhausen, Buchenwald and Dachau. He did.
He did, yeah, so that they would work for him. I think the key document for me is his pension. It's a pension document that's signed by Oswald Pohl, and he would be getting his pension from the state in 1958. So this is a man who had been unemployed, who'd lived through the Depression, who had a wife and 4 children. And I think that he wanted to stay economically, financially safe. And I think also that he was working for the state. He was doing things that were sanctioned and approved by the state. And so I'm sure that he convinced himself that he was doing what he believed was right, even though somewhere in his head, he must have known it was wrong.
Well, who can say? I mean, there's the famous phrase, Hannah Arendt, the banality of evil, which was used by Eichmann, which is obviously, but in fact, Eichmann was not a banal person. As the biographies make, he was much more complicated. In a way, he was quite interesting. But your grandfather, I mean, that he was, I'm trying not to, well, I can insult him, but anyway, but he was fairly banal, was he not? I mean, that really does kind of capture the person I read about. Just seems to me, you got a bit bored with him if you sat next to him on a train for a long journey and,
Yeah, I think he was like so many people, a mediocrity who suddenly had a uniform, a status, a chauffeur. He suddenly had a position in life, and he was living on an estate where people said, yes, he's one of these good people. Yeah, I think he liked it. I'm sure he did.
I mean, not remarkable in any way, but doing his job, and of course, there's nothing really different about him to what, 4 million Germans, 6 million Germans, 8 million, who could say? But
yeah, exactly. He's no different to the guy who drives the train to the concentration camp. It's my job. I've got a load to deliver. Back I go for another one.
The Germans would have, the phrase "the desk murderer," isn't it? Is a German.
Yes, he was called a Schreibtischtäter.
Yeah. So again, can I just ask? So there's 2 things about both of you. One is why did your family leave Germany and end up in Scotland? And then I want to ask Naomi the obvious and equal question: why on earth did your father, Naomi, go back to Germany? So first of all, why did your family leave Germany? Well, there's no reason to. They weren't being persecuted. There was no further prospect of any charges or anything. So why did they quit?
It was an accident of circumstance. The family moved back to Hameln, which was then the base of a British military occupying force. And my aunt, who'd already lost a fiancé in the war, met a Scottish soldier, a thoroughly unpleasant, bigoted Scot, who took her back to Scotland once he'd made her pregnant. And my dad in the late 50s thought, well, Scotland's economy looks better than Germany's, so I'll join her.
That was a bit of a bad call, wasn't it? Yeah.
Just a bit.
Yes, there's shades of Tom Stoppard and his father there, who exactly something very, very similar happened. If we'd love to get him on, by the way, if he's watching, but and father almost then disowned him, a very unpleasant person. Naomi, why then did your father, would go back to Munich, which is, that and Nuremberg are the 2 most Nazi cities in Europe? In Germany, Germany. Why did he go back?
He didn't go back. He was liberated close to Munich, and he actually stayed. He had nothing after the war. He had one surviving sister. They found each other. She equally had nothing. Parents gone, home gone, and he needed to first of all apply for a citizenship, German citizenship. And then he had to apply for studies. He had missed his baccalaureate, and he had to do some sort of alternative exams and go onto the ladder. And actually there was a group of survivors. They became like his family from Poland who had stayed in Germany. He did want to emigrate to America, and he had a place in San Francisco. My mum told me that, and he went, and the Americans changed their mind. Why they changed their minds, my mum doesn't know. And my dad was gutted. He left in the middle of his medical studies, so he had to eat humble pie and beg the Germans to take him back, and he stayed. Also, just to let you know, the audience, that there's a group of survivors in Munich, I was told in 2018 by a neurologist and psychiatrist who were in a permanent catatonic state. That is, they were not able to function. They were physically alive, but psychologically and morally and emotionally dead. So they're not all formidable after these traumas. I think the people that we see now, survivors, that's my point. Everybody goes through the traumas in a different way.
There's already 2 people who are identified having mentioning their own grandparents in similar, and someone else has drawn attention, which I would repeat actually, to Robert Little's book, The Kindly Ones, which is a novel, but again, as if folks haven't read it, it's quite a hard read actually, I must say. But The Kindly Ones is Robert Little's book. Or no, it's his son, isn't it? Anyway, it doesn't matter. But just I may have misunderstood then. So he had to get a German passport. Well, because he was Polish. I mean, I thought Munich was where he'd been first deported from, but no. So
he was deported from Poland and liberated close to Munich.
I see. Okay, so he didn't kind of come back and reclaim the family property or the family flat. He just started again in Munich. But he didn't go to Israel or somewhere like that, or no, obviously not.
He did want to, after marrying my mum, to go and live on a kibbutz, but my mum, it wasn't for my mum, the French lady, to live on a kibbutz, who'd always grown up in a town. That was very much country life in those days, and wasn't for mum.
Now, modern Germany is a completely different state from the Germany we're talking about. I don't think anybody could possibly disagree with that. But I mean, I just remember from my childhood, if I'm allowed to say, I had an uncle who actually survived Auschwitz as a kid, which is unbelievable, went to Israel, qualified as doctor, came back and worked in Dortmund. And I remember when you saw that picture of Dortmund, it's not that much prettier now. And he was a doctor, and we would stay with him at Christmas, and he would be on call. And we're talking about, I was about 8, it was about 1964. He was called out to see someone who then said, no, I'm not having the Jew coming to see my wife. And he came back and said this had happened, and then no one else in the practice would deal with this person until they agreed to see him. But there must have been incidents for your father in which he was reminded of what he was. This is the Germany 1940s and 50s is not the Germany now. Did he not? Did you remember such occasions? You were there.
Yes, I was born in 66.
Okay, you weren't quite.
My age away.
All right, no, sorry.
And
I'm just going to
my
let my dog
father
out of the way.
found it.
I can hear you, but I can hear and see you, but my dog is creating. So you just keep talking. I can hear you.
Okay. My father founded the Association of Persecutees for ex-concentration camp survivors, Jewish and non-Jewish. And he spoke twice yearly, once at Dachau and once in the Munich town hall. And he very much believed in not only commemorating, but also educating, and believed in educating the great, the good, the politicians, as well as, of course, the children and students. And as we see today, it always veers into politics, human nature, human emotions. Often it gets so much intellectualized, but really, when you look at dictators, it comes from a place of the heart and gets translated into intellect, I always feel. Was present then and is present today, and the hatred hasn't gone. Immediately after World War II, they carried on with, the Nazis, just covertly rather than overtly.
I've been corrected by David Freeman, one of our sternest critics, who says that I've confused Tom Stoppard's stepfather, Major Stoppard, with his actual father, who was killed by the Japanese. And of course, you're absolutely right. Sorry, David. Mea culpa on that one. But I mean, Naomi, let me just take issue that, I mean, most of us would think modern Germany now is a very different place. So, you know, your message was, I thought, rather almost depressing, that, you know, human nature can't change and et cetera, et cetera. But I would say that actually, you know, a visitor to the modern republic would say it's actually remarkable how much human nature can change.
So maybe I should qualify that. I always say that we're all ordinary, capable of extraordinary things, both in the positive and in the negative, and we're all capable, as we've seen, of good and evil. And that's what I mean by human nature, that we all have characteristics that we had all those years ago and that we have today. Of course, Germany has made great strides in apologizing and feeling to this day extremely guilty about Nazi Germany. You know, the youth is not responsible for their fathers or forefathers. That's certainly from my generational point of view. But my point was that human beings are human beings, whether we were born in the 40s, 50s, 60s, or today. And so as we see with certain elements, we are all still capable of the same. Equally, we're capable of change. Hence, I want my talks to be inspiring and positive and uplifting, asking you all not to be bystanders, and empower you and share your wisdom if it's a mature audience, your life wisdom.
Oh, they are quite mature, trust me. They are. But there are also a lot of them are doctors. Some I recognize, I can see already, and you're a doctor too.
Yes.
And of course, one of the things we've had to come to terms with as a profession, following on from the Nuremberg doctors trial, not the major trial, but the Nuremberg doctors trial. Do you think, and opinions differ on this a little bit, but one of the speakers has raised this as to what should we be doing in terms of do you think there's a special role for educating doctors, given the role that many, not all, but many, probably most, played in the crime, some of them incredibly upfront and personal. But of course, as did lawyers, as did writers. Your profession, Derek, is also not immune. But let's talk about doctors a little bit. You're talking to medical audiences. Do you think there's lessons there, or do you think that now it's taught in most of our curriculum? I think it is at King's and it is at Glasgow. But what lessons should we be drawing from that? Your father became a doctor, presumably as a result of his experiences. I mean, it wasn't random what he chose.
No, he became a doctor, worked as a dentist, and even in his private time, he never stopped helping humanity and speaking up and out for others. We were taught from a very young age to answer the telephone and be very polite and in the very long German manner. I think, and no disrespect to my colleagues, that doctors are human and lawyers are human and writers are human. So everybody has to be taught it. And it does have to be taught it, because I think without having read The Long Night, and I was born to the Jewish faith, and in that house, I wouldn't really have known what man is capable of. So in particular, medics. And unfortunately, the man who was my father's mentor, Professor Mikorai, if you read his introduction, was not only my father's mentor and professor of neurology and psychiatry, but he became a personal friend to my parents, respecting their kosher home. Twice yearly they met in each other's flats. What transpired from doing research on the internet in 2018 was that Professor Mikorai was a Nazi and went and actually used medicine and injected people. What I didn't find out was whether it was Jewish or what sort of people he injected with neurogenic medicines, and went by helicopter. And yet my father never knew. And my mum, when I found out, could not accept that, because he had been the most charming man. who was a dear close friend to my father. So you see, man can be very chameleon-like, and I think every doctor, as a human being, has to learn, and maybe particularly doctors in the caring profession, because after all, we're not saints, we're human.
True. Now, I've just lost the name now, but someone else has asked about what scars do you carry from your I think I see. Okay, so I think this is asking about your father then. I mean, who I've not been able yet to read his book, but from the summaries of it, and I was reading some of the reviews, who comes over as a very gentle person who was obviously, you know, most of his time in Germany was treating people who had tainted backgrounds. I mean, it was just, yeah. But underneath, do you think that he did? Do you think that he can? I mean, he must have done. There must have been ways that you must have realized later. I say,
What?
and it doesn't follow that those ways in which he'd been affected, you know, in his personality or how.
Of course, he was affected. But I was 12 when my father died. I lost him very young, and I had the classic father-daughter relationship. My dad was my hero. My dad did have nightmares. Again, my mother told us that. We were very protected. That's why I said we had this egocentric childhood. I felt that life revolved around us. I didn't really know. I knew my dad was special, but I didn't really understand how special. So that really didn't transpire. And really credit to my dad and indeed my mum to hide this past from us. Yes, it was in the background, in the shadows, something ominous lurked. But again, you know, only my imagination could have told me that. So yeah, but of course he suffered. He will have never been, he'll say it in his introduction, he was never the same again. Outside, he says they looked normal, and the psyche and the soul will forever have been changed and affected. So
no, they're different, certainly, yes. I mean, it's impossible to generalize about any survivor. They're all different in all sorts of ways. But Derek, let's go back to you. That we had Philip Sands interviewed about a year ago, and of course he made a relationship with the son of two different families. Or one of them was Nicholas Frank, the son of Hans Frank, who was hanged at the main Nuremberg trial, the one before Otto Pol, ghastly man. And Nicholas said that the day that his father was hanged was the happiest day of his life, and to this day, he's still alive. He keeps a picture of his father in his coffin at the Nuremberg before it was cremated, and looks at it every day to remind himself that his father really is dead. How now, I'm not expecting you to react like that, but how, with the knowledge now that you have and your uncles have, how do you think they would react now to their grandfather? Your grandfather, sorry. That was a bit of a convoluted question, but I think you get the meaning. Derek,
yeah, I do.
Yeah,
I do. I somehow feel that my uncle, who was younger, would have a much more balanced view. I feel that my father would have refused to accept that his father was a bad man. So he would follow the von Wächter route.
Yeah.
I think my aunt my aunt stayed anti-Semitic for the rest of her life. As the oldest of the four siblings, as the one who had been thoroughly indoctrinated with Nazi education from the word go. My uncle was and still is the least anti-Semitic, and in fact he and his wife adopted two little girls who were orphaned at Chernobyl, girls that would have been classified under Hitler as Untermenschen.
Indeed.
And the fact that they are both, my uncle and his wife are really behind Noemie and I. They've met Noemie on screen. They want to promote harmony between people. You know, they're the antithesis. So I think my uncle has a very realistic view of his father. Whereas my dad, he got dementia, he died, he never lived to understand the book that I'd written, thank God. But I don't think he would have accepted that his father had done these things somehow.
They just didn't happen, or that, you know, it was justified, or you just said it didn't happen.
Yeah, exactly. And looking at Holocaust academics, so many of them say that the children of Nazis in general found it extremely hard to accept what their parents had done. They would be refused to accept it, or they would be told another narrative, probably by their mothers. And it's the grandchildren who did not know these previous generations who say, I want to know what my ancestor did.
Mm. So people are also making comparisons with the Ukraine, but I don't think, we are running out of time. I mean, yeah, we don't know how that story is going to play out, do we? Russia and the Ukraine, it is different, but and of course, as I think most people now know, Zelensky, his grandparents he's Jewish, and but he's also Russian, very Russian actually, very Russian. So who knows how that is going to play out? I don't think any of us do. Now, don't go away, folks, because I just need to do just a couple of quick housekeeping things just to remind people. Here we are. Yeah. So we've got coming up. So to say that our next of these In Conversations will be talking about Ukraine. It's Henry Marsh, the neurosurgeon, who of course has worked a lot in the Ukraine. He's on the 6th of April. In conversation, and I'm sure, well, I'm 100% certain the conversation will turn to that, as he spent a lot of his later career teaching neurosurgery in the Ukraine, and he speaks it. Our very first live in person for ages will be with Angela Rippon on the 20th of April, who I doubt will be talking about the Ukraine, but you never know. And then plenty more to come, Simon Sharma and Nick Robinson as well. But the big thing for us tomorrow for the Royal Society of Medicine is of our lunchtime seminars, our COVID seminars. It is our 100th episode. Hard to believe, isn't it? It's 2 years since it started. We had our first episode with Rachel Clark talking about dying, death and bereavement under COVID. And we will now have our 100th episode. So I'll be interviewing Christopher Whitty, our marvelous CMO, and also Jonathan Van Tam, and many others who you've seen on the series that you've been following will be there. It's not a celebration, but it's certainly to reflect back on 100 episodes, 2 years. Where are we now? Okay, so that's where we are. And now this has been an experiment, Derek and Naomi, but I think we've done pretty well. Once you've learned how to show the pictures, it's great. And we'll see what people say later on, but thank you very much for coming. And it is just endlessly fascinating. I mean, they'll never mean, you know, people still argue about the causes of the Peloponnesian War and things like that. So we will never, ever, ever have any understanding really of what happened. And you said that your grandfather, Naomi, you said that many of the Nazis were very ordinary people. And that, of course, is the title, what I still think, and we mentioned before, is the best book yet to be ever written so far on the Holocaust, Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men. And he does talk about, he says at the end about, you know, the task historian, he says, explaining is not excusing and understanding is not forgiving. So you've helped explain, Derek, and as you indeed have, and I thoroughly recommend your book. And of course, Naomi, your father's memoir written so early on, again, gives us further, you know, historical material and an amazing story of survival. I mean, utterly against the odds, but neither of us are excusing, neither of you are forgiving, but I think you have helped us to explain. So I thank you very much. And I thank the audience, and more questions coming. Bit late, folks, too late now. And next time.
I just say that they can contact us via your society, if that's okay.
All right, yes, of course.
They can email us with pleasure, and we've got websites as well. Just Google us.
We will find us. We will pass around the details of the websites and the books, as we always do, to everyone who's signed up. I should have said that, but you will have that information as well. Okay, good night all. Thank you for being with us, and thanks so much, Noemie. Normally we would be taking you out for a drink or dinner now, and ditto Derek. Unfortunately, we still are not quite at that stage, but we will very shortly be able to do that. So
we'll have a rain check.
Yeah, all you have now is our heartfelt thanks, and well done.
Thank you.
Okay, okay. Good night.
Night.
Good night.
Good night.